This is Doug DeMuro, and today I'm going to talk about one of my very favorite subjects, and that would be weird cars. I love weird cars, and a lot of people these days are saying that weird cars are kind of dying off, that automakers aren't making weird cars anymore. The Nissan Murano Cross Cabriolets, the Fiat Multiplas, the Subaru Bajas, that stuff just doesn't make financial sense for big car companies to take a risk on anymore. That's what people say. I totally disagree. I think there are still a lot of weird cars, and today I'm going to go through the 11 weirdest cars on sale new today. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this crazy Freightliner truck thing, which sold for $85,000. We love the weird stuff on Cars and Bids. This Geo Tracker with a Chevy Camaro V6 engine swap sold for over $14,000. We really love the weird stuff. And this fantastic 91 Nissan 300Z Turbo sold for $35,000, good money for a great car. If you're looking to sell your cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. We'll get your auction listed quickly and get your car sold. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, Cars and Bids has a great selection of daily auctions at carsandbids.com. Okay, so weird cars. So back in the day, there were a lot of weird cars. I can name a million. The Dodge Dakota convertible, that Chevy HHR SS high-performance panel van that I reviewed. The Subaru Brat was insane. There's so many. There were tons and tons and tons. I mean, you could name a zillion. But there's this perception that weird cars are dying off, that manufacturers aren't taking as many risks, and frankly, I think that's not true at all. So I'm gonna go through the list, the weirdest new cars on sale today, the weird cars that you can buy new. I'm gonna go in alphabetical order, proving that yes, there are a lot of weird cars still on the market for those of you who love the quirky and strange vehicles like I do. Okay, number one, first weird car, the BMW i3. Now this is probably the least weird of the weird cars on this list, but I think that's only because we've gotten used to them. These have been around for like 8 years, and so it's not as like, oh wow, but when you think about it, this thing is nuts. It looks like a pod, it has rear opening back doors, the interior materials are bizarre, the tires are like 3 inches thick wide. The car is made of carbon fiber, and yet despite that, used ones are like 10 grand. You get a carbon tub for like 10 grand. It is a really, really strange vehicle when you really think about it. And sitting in it, I mean, it's got all this headroom. It's like you're sitting in an egg. It makes no sense. It's a bizarre vehicle, and I think that that's a really weird car that nobody really talks about as being weird, but it is really, really weird. Okay, next weird car on my list, that would be the Dodge Durango SRT HELLCAT. In case you haven't been paying attention, Dodge has recently started making a HELLCAT version of its Durango SUV. Now, they've been making HELLCAT versions of all their cars. You have the Challenger HELLCAT, the Charger, all that stuff. Obviously, they put it in the Jeep as well. But the Durango is especially weird because it's a 3-row family SUV with over 700 horsepower. Now, I've only seen like 1 or 2 of these on the street. They're not going to be common. It's very expensive for a Dodge Durango, even with all that power. Nobody needs that much power. And I think combining a 3-row SUV with 700 plus horsepower is just bizarre. And I think years in the future, when cars become more plug-in hybrid, more electric, more turbocharged, we're gonna look back at this thing and be like, that happened? So it was real? But indeed it is. Okay, next weird car, the Hyundai Santa Cruz. This is a little pickup truck crossover thing. I'm either about to review it or I just reviewed it, depending on when this video goes up. But it's like a little pickup truck based on the Hyundai Tucson crossover, and it's really a strange thing. Like, the top version has a turbo 4-cylinder with like almost 300 horsepower in like a little car-based truck that has a truck bed, and it's made by Hyundai. Like, the whole concept of it is strange. And the small pickup segment clearly appears to be kind of making some level of comeback with the new Ford Maverick, but what I think sincerely is this isn't gonna sell. This is gonna be like the Subaru Baja in terms of popularity, and it's gonna die after 1 generation, and it's really not gonna get a lot of sales. And I think it's just really, really strange that it even exists, frankly. And right now it's like a new car, so people are kind of excited about it. There's a little hype around it. It's like, what's gonna happen? I'll tell you what's gonna happen. It's gonna go down in history as being really strange. This is the Subaru Baja of the 2020s. It's really a weird car. Okay, next up, here's a weird car that most people don't even know exists. You can buy a brand new Jeep Wrangler with right-hand drive from Jeep. You can do this today. You can go to Jeep and order a right-hand drive Jeep Wrangler. They make these primarily for rural postal service workers. They sit on the right side of the car so they can just lean out the window and deliver mail. And they want a Jeep because in these rural areas where you're driving like a mile between mailboxes, usually those are like the snowy areas of the country or the wet, you know, there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of whatever. And so the Jeeps are the vehicles that they want. And so mail carriers in rural areas will frequently be using these Jeeps. And you can buy them new. You don't have to be a postal worker to go buy it. If you want a right-hand drive Jeep Wrangler, you can go and purchase one new today. It's insane. Now, obviously nobody does this because it's incredibly annoying to drive right-hand drive in a left-hand drive country and vice versa, but it is possible. They're primarily meant for and purchased by these postal carriers, but it exists. A brand new right-hand drive Jeep Wrangler. That is a weird car that you can buy new. Okay, next up, here's a very weird car that you can buy new that nobody's really thinking of as a weird car, but it is. That would be the new Land Rover Defender 90 with the V8. Okay, the regular Defender with the 4 doors is not weird at all. It's like a normal 4-door SUV, off-road capable, whatever. But they're gonna do a V8 version. That's pretty cool. That's like a performance SUV. That's not also all that weird, but performance SUV getting into the kind of the cool, interesting segment. The 2-door is weird. There are not a lot of 2-door SUVs. Every 2-door SUV in history has failed. Eventually, every single SUV offered with 2 doors eventually failed without exception. Except the Jeep Wrangler. But even that kind of proves that this is true because 80% of Wrangler sales now are 4-door models. Once the 4-door became available, people just went there. So nobody really wants 2-door SUVs. So it's weird that there is one. It's really weird that there's a 2-door V8. This is like a 500 horsepower 2-door SUV. So you already have these kind of strange proportions and a rather impractical vehicle that not that many people are gonna buy. And now there's a performance version of it. It's a crazy thing when you really think about it. You can get like a high performance Land Rover Defender coupe, essentially. Absolutely a bizarre vehicle. I suspect they're gonna sell almost none of them, but this will go down as a weird, unusual car from this era. Okay, next up, another weird new car, the Mazda MX-30. Now this isn't on sale yet, but it's about to be, and what it is like a compact hybrid crossover, which doesn't sound weird until you look at it, and well, look at it. It's absolutely bizarre. It has this sort of coupe-like design, like the old Mini Paceman, which by the way was a weird car in itself, but then it has like rear opening, rear hinged back doors, which is obviously unusual, and then it has some other strange things like sort of squared wheel arches, and it's definitely an unusual and interesting and rather odd vehicle. This sort of has kind of Toyota FJ Cruiser vibes in terms of like the squared off wheel arches and the kind of upright blocky sides and obviously those rear hinged doors, but then it's a Mazda crossover with a hybrid powertrain. I don't have any idea if this thing is going to sell. I guess it's already on sale in some markets like in China or maybe Japan. It's weird. It's really, really weird. And I strongly suspect that this is going to be a big flop and it's going to go down as one of those cars they only made a couple thousand of, and we look back in 10 years being like, what was that about? It's really a strange car. You'd think if Mazda wanted to finally go to like a hybrid, plug-in hybrid, whatever powertrain, they would do it with a relatively popular common car already, like the Mazda CX-5, but instead they're giving us this really strange thing. I'm very excited to review this rather bizarre car. Okay, next up, another car that people don't really think of as weird until you really stop and think about it. That would be the Mercedes-Benz Mercedes-AMG GLA 45. What this is a subcompact crossover, and it's a front-wheel drive car in its normal form, and then you can get it with all-wheel drive. And it's like a tiny little crossover, like the size of like a mini Countryman. I think it's even smaller than that. Like it's a little subcompact crossover. And then they, for some reason, do an AMG version with almost 400 horsepower. It makes no sense. Mercedes just feels like they have to AMGify every car in their lineup, which I can get behind. But this is just weird. And it's like, basically it's like a tall, hot hatchback with 400 horsepower from Mercedes-Benz. And the regular version is pretty much only sold to people, like the GLA 250 is pretty much only sold to people who like want a Mercedes crossover and they're like really stretching with their budget. And so they like lease one and there's a deal or whatever, and it kind of gets them into the Mercedes-Benz family. The AMG version is expensive. It's like 60 grand. I don't know who buys it. But it's like a 400 horsepower, tiny front-wheel drive based crossover. And we're now in the second generation of this car. The first gen didn't sell all that well, although they did do a version with a massive rear wing, which made no sense. But they brought it back. The GLA sells pretty well, but the AMG version was kind of a dud. But here it is. It's available again. Now, BMW, interestingly, BMW and Mercedes are locked in this like death match to outsell each other. And BMW also sells little crossovers in this space, the X1 and the X2, but they don't have M versions of them because they're rational. Mercedes, for some reason, is a 400 horsepower GLA. It's bizarre. It really is a weird car that you're probably not thinking about. Okay, next up. This next one is a weird car that I just love in principle, and that would be the new Subaru Outback Wilderness. And what this is a Subaru Outback that's given more ground clearance and more like SUV capability and styling cues. And I find this to be funny because the Outback originated as a station wagon that was supposed to be like a car-like alternative to an SUV. So if you wanted an SUV, but you didn't want like the height and sort of that kind of above everything, you know, look and feel, you wanted something a little bit more car-like and simple, well, there was the Outback. And over the years, they've raised the Outback to the point where now it's taller than a lot of SUVs. Well, now there's an even more SUV-ish version, and it's just insane when you think about the genesis of this. Like, this was a car that was an SUV alternative that has grown into an SUV, and now there's an SUV version of it. It doesn't make any sense at all. And by the way, I think it's ugly, like wildly ugly. Almost to the point where it's kind of cool. Like, they really did that? You look at it and you're like, huh, like the G-Wagon convertible. It's ugly to the point where you're like, okay, that's interesting. But I can't believe that they manufactured this vehicle as like a SUV version of a wagon that was an alternative to an SUV that became an SUV. It's so weird, but it exists. Okay, next up, here's another very weird car that's on sale today that you don't see, so you don't really think about it, but it is weird. And that would be the TRD versions, the Toyota Camry, and specifically the Toyota Avalon. I saw an Avalon TRD on the road yesterday for probably the first time ever. And I was just blown away by this. I reviewed one like 18 months ago. I haven't seen one until now. It's like a $60,000+ Toyota Avalon with a giant front grille and all these like sporty ground effects and red stitching to make it look cool. But at the end of the day, it's an Avalon and they didn't add any more power. So it's not any faster. It just like maybe handles a little better and it looks ridiculous. And I think these cars are gonna go down as like, what was Toyota even dreaming up when they created these vehicles? Like such a bizarre and unusual car to make a high performance version of the car that is probably the least high performance-y of any car on the market today. That would be the Toyota Avalon, in my opinion. It's like the Buick of the Toyota lineup. And they're like, yeah, let's lower it and give it wheels and like a ground effects kit. Bizarre, absolutely crazy. There are ways to make your automaker seem more sporty and fun, and throwing a ground effects kit on random cars that nobody wants, that's not the way to do it. Okay, next up, down to the last two weirdest cars on sale today. One of them is the Volkswagen Arteon. So when I was younger, Volkswagen had this plan that they were going to be a luxury brand and that Audi was also going to be a luxury brand and that somehow that would work. And of course, what ended up happening was what everybody predicted would happen, which is that Audi became a luxury brand and Volkswagen is positioning itself in the mainstream. And that has actually worked relatively well for Volkswagen. They've done pretty well with the Atlas crossover. The Jetta still does well. The Tiguan obviously does very well as a small SUV. They now have a new smaller SUV called the Taos. They're finally starting to figure out the American market, except for some reason they still sell the Arteon here, which is like a $45,000 coupe sedan that is like intended to compete with BMW and Mercedes, except it's a Volkswagen. And 10 years ago, that was already a tough sell when the Volkswagen CC came out, but back then Volkswagen had a little bit more premium brand positioning. These days, Volkswagen's brand positioning is now like clearly mainstream. Nobody thinks that brand is like desirably luxurious anymore. It's no longer like the cool, luxurious alternative to Honda and Toyota. It just kind of feels like Honda and Toyota. So why they think they can sell like a $50,000 luxury coupe sedan is beyond me. And of course, the truth is they can't sell them. I've seen maybe 6 since that thing went on sale like 3 years ago. It's way too expensive. That will be a desirable used car. I suspect it loses value fast and it definitely looks good. But it's weird, and that's something that is very strange if you really think about it. And finally, our last interesting and weird car on sale today, the Volvo V90. So station wagons are kind of dead, as everybody knows, but Volvo knows that you can still make money with these like off-roady looking station wagons. There's like a V90 cross country. It's kind of lifted, looks a little like an SUV, but for the die-hard Volvo wagon people who don't want that, you can still get a V90 that doesn't look like the off-roady version. It's just a regular wagon. In the United States, that car is special order only. Meaning every time you see a non-cross-country V90, it was ordered specially by the person who's driving it. They don't stock them at dealers. And this is weird. I mean, to offer like an extra body style, an extra version of a car just for this purpose, they're tremendously rare. They're only purchased by like die-hard wagon enthusiasts who for some reason can't handle a couple inches of ground clearance. And they're really, really strange cars. And I think that is definitely one of the strangest cars in the market. The fact that Volvo decided to do this to keep these kind of Volvo wagon purists in the fold. And that's gonna be a really weird used car. You're gonna see those in a few years and think, wow, that was a rare and special car. Almost like they do with AMG, Mercedes-AMG wagons. Obviously the performance isn't the same, but the rarity I think still will be. So there you go. There are some weird cars still out there. And frankly, this is just the weird cars that are new. It doesn't even account for some that like just left the market. I was thinking the Cadillac CT6V Blackwing was a weird car. Obviously the Range Rover Evoque convertible is a weird car. The Honda HR-V with a manual transmission was weird. And yes, that did exist, no longer, but it did up until like last year. There are some weird cars out there. They're not dead yet, which is great for me because I love weird cars on the Doug DeMuro YouTube channel.